Hello and welcome to another episode of Canadian History X. Thank you for joining me on another epic journey into what it is about Canadian history we all love. Now, of course, with Canadian History X, I look into the little stories, not the big ones, the stories about the little people who helped make this country great. And about the towns where these people lived, and the stories those towns had to tell. Some of those towns are still around, others have faded away. And this story is about one of those towns, Govenlock. Now, Govanlock is a really unique town because it at one point was a thriving place with bootleggers and rum runners and police, and it was like a place you would expect to see in the Wild West, but it was right in Saskatchewan, and for a time it thrived, but today nothing remains. So let's dive in and learn a bit about Govenlock.
Now, many ghost towns in Saskatchewan have unique histories, but few have a history as unique and as interesting as Govenlock. The small Saskatchewan town located in the extreme southwest along the Alberta border was once a thriving location for many years, thanks to some decisions made in the United States. Before we get into what made Govenlock a popular place to be, we gotta dive back to 1910, when it was nothing but a patch of land owned by William Govenlock. Now, I think you see where this is going. And it was in 1910 that William moved his family to the area and applied for a homestead. And as the first pioneers to the area, Govenlock and his family established the first post office, and Bessie, his wife, became the first postmaster. When the CPR decided to run the rail through the area, they chose to have the line stop where the Govenlock homestead was located. And to honor William, the CPR gave the community his name. And it did not take long for the community to begin to spring up. In 1914, Govenlock had its first hotel, a building of 2 stories with 10 rooms. The hotel was built by John Lindner, who owned it for the first 3 years. In 1917, a very interesting tale emerged about the hotel and how it was sold. According to Edith Byron, in a story published in From Sage to Tinder, James Gaff came to town after attending a stampede in Chinook, and he was looking for a room to rent. He asked the price of a room, and he was shocked by how much it cost, and he told Lindner he just wanted to rent a room, not the entire hotel. Lindner said he couldn't afford the hotel even if he wanted it. So Gaff took this as a challenge, asked how much for the hotel, then promptly wrote a check for that amount and bought the hotel. Unfortunately, I don't know how much the hotel cost, but we're probably talking a few $100s. As for Lindner, he would open a service station after owning the local pool hall, and he had operated for 30 years until 1950. So Govenlock continued to grow and would soon have a population of 151 people. In 1919, the community had grain elevators, blacksmith shops, a service station selling Model Ts, the hotel, a meat shop, a school, and 2 general stores. And it was around this time, a pair of brothers showed up out of Yorkton, and they were the Bronfman brothers. And they opened up a liquor warehouse, as did another man by the name of Archie McCovey, and another man by the name of Joe Bandafini. Things were about to get a lot crazier for the community that year, and these liquor houses played a big part. It was in 1919 the Montana declared prohibition, and that resulted in travelers coming from Montana to Govenlock to buy alcohol. And it did not take long for Govenlock to latch on to its new windfall. 4 liquor warehouses were built, and gambling and parties became common in the community.
Now, I said Govenlock was a place out of the Wild West, but it really wasn't that wild. There was occasionally violence and some incidents, but overall, everybody behaved themselves. They were just there to get some liquor. But there is one interesting story that came from ghost towns of the Redcoat Trail, and it relates how one rum runner was shot and killed while he was running with a bunch of liquor to the Montana border. Unfortunately, he didn't get there in time. Now, sometimes thefts would happen in broad daylight. Thieves would just go up to a vehicle and take the liquor right out of it. Or they might just go to the train and take the liquor right out of that. And this was very common. It was very hard for the RCMP to deal with. Now, since bootlegging was a dangerous business, and it was very easy to lose some of that liquor that you were trying to get to the US border, various liquor warehouses would actually try and do what they could to make sure you had safe passage from Govenlock all the way to the United States border. The Bronfman brothers were one such outlet, and what they would do, and this would only cost $12 extra per case, is they would guarantee safe travel from Govenlock to the Montana border. If you were hijacked, they would replace all of the goods. If you were arrested, they would pay your bond. And all you had to do was just pay that little bit extra for that insurance plan. And this actually allowed the brothers to have a tidy profit, and they were able to grow their business, eventually having warehouses all over the place, including Yorkton and Regina, and they would become Canada's largest liquor exporter for a time.
During those years, Americans would come to the community in cars filled with sandbags. Once they arrived at the liquor warehouse, the sandbags were thrown out, and liquor was put into the car. At this time, Canadian beer cost 12 cents per barrel. Americans could also get a barrel with 24 4-quart bottles wrapped in straw for $24. They could then sell that in the United States for $140. And since most cars could carry 14 barrels of beer and 5 cases of whiskey, Americans could earn a profit of $2,500 with just one visit to Govenlock. So we see why Govanlock was such a popular place to be. Now, according to George Harding, a former resident in the book Honky Tonk Town, open-topped cars would arrive around 3 p.m., each with a license plate from somewhere in the United States. The drivers would go to the pool hall and spend some time playing pool and poker. In the evening, each car would back up to the liquor warehouses and be loaded, and then be on their way to the United States.
Now, as I said, things could get a bit rowdy in Govenlock, but overall it was a safe community, but it had some really interesting stories to tell. One such story is that of Jack Hoffman. Now, Jack Hoffman was described as kind of a rough and tough individual, and he loved 2 things more than anything else. He loved baseball and step dancing. But we're going to be talking about his love of baseball, because the story relating to him relates to baseball. Now, way back during the early years of Govenlock, we're talking about 1920, 1921, during its thriving heyday, Jack Hoffman was actually playing in a game between the married men of Govenlock and the single men of Govenlock, and he was playing on the single men's team. And in the middle of the game, his wife suddenly shows up. And what had happened was she's been hunting for him all the way from Montana trying to find him, and she just happened to get into Govenlock at that point, and she caught him. And so a big brouhaha erupted as everyone was trying to figure out which team he was supposed to play on. Eventually the dispute was settled, and Jack Hoffman moved over to the married men's team, which incidentally also won the game. The good times could not always last though, and eventually the government of Saskatchewan cracked down on places like Govenlock and their thriving business of helping bootleggers and rum runners. So what happened was the government decided that in order to have a liquor warehouse, the community had to have a population of 10,000 individuals. And there was only a couple places in Saskatchewan where that was actually the case, including Regina and Saskatoon. And this would spell the end in 1922 for Govenlock.
Now, the peak year for the community was the year before in 1921, when a lot of people were coming through and crops were good. According to Professor Roy Hansen, in a letter to F.H. Auld, Deputy Minister of Agriculture for the province, there was considerable rye in the district that looked very good. Before long, with no more money coming in from the men from Montana, stores began to close one by one, and things would just get worse when the Great Depression hit. Phil Hanlon, who moved to Govenlock in 1929, began working at the local elevator, and he would lose his job within 2 years when the elevator shut down. In the book Prairie Wool, he stated that he lost his job because of a crop failure and no grain being delivered to the area. It wasn't an immediate decline for the community, with some residents calling it home for several decades. In the years after the Prohibition heyday, Govenlock would have a hand in shaping the southwest of the province. One interesting story comes from the book Cypress Hills Country, that the last swift fox was caught near Govenlock in 1928. The fox would be gone from the province until 1988, when it was reintroduced. In 1929, Jack Shepherd, according to his recollection in the book From Sage to Timber, would go to the Govenlock Rodeo as a young man and see competitors from across the area come out to see who was the best cowboy of them all. The Govenlock Rodeo was a very popular affair through the 1930s and the 1940s. Govenlock would form a roping club that would help legitimize the rodeo activities in the area. New calf roping chutes would also be built during that time. In 1932, Govenlock had an important part in creating the historical attraction of Fort Walsh. According to the book West of Yesterday, in May of that year, the Canadian Club of Govenlock and the Old Timers Association of Maple Creek began working together to find a way to mark the old site of Fort Walsh, the old Northwest Mounted Police post in the Cypress Hills. The landowners of the area had passed away, and it was decided that the 4 corners of the former stockade would be marked with concrete blocks. A rifle shoot was held between the 2 groups at a picnic, with the losing side having to pay for the blocks. Once the picnic was over, work began to mark the stockade and create the historical site of Fort Walsh. In 1949, Govenlock still had enough of a role to play in the area when it served as a mail hub for the Southwest. From that year until 1956, mail was actually diverted from Maple Creek to Govenlock. But the slow decline would continue. In 1962, the last elevator would be demolished. By 1976, Govanlock would be a shell of what it once was and would lose its village status. The postmaster would leave in 1976 as well, officially closing down the post office. That year, Govenlock was deemed abandoned. In 1990, the RM would eventually bulldoze the entire community except for the community hall. Today, nothing remains of Govenlock except for some concrete foundations, a few wooden sidewalks, and that community hall. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Canadian History X, and if you did, please let me know. You can email me at crwbaird@gmail.com. That's B-A-I-R-D. You can also reach me on Twitter at Craig Baird, CraigBaird, and you can find me on Instagram at Bairdo37, BAIRDO37. Thanks again.